I had heard of it for years. It's in another book called Lost Cabin.
That's Jackie Dorothy. She's a fellow podcaster and a reporter.
And that's when I stumbled onto the other stories of the other skeletons that had been found along Badwater Creek.
The stories she's about to share are littered with events and place names that sound like something from a Hardy Boys novel. You know, Lost Cabin, Badwater Creek, Skeleton Canyon. But in Wyoming, where these stories took place, they're all real. On this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, in which we interview everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, Jackie takes us out to Badwater Creek to hear the stories and legends about 16 human skeletons that have been found over the decades during 3 different incidents in isolated parts of the Cowboy State.
Badwater Creek is in Fremont County in central Wyoming. It doesn't look full hardly ever. Most of the time, you can actually see the sandbars. The reason it earned its name is because of how deceptive it is. What happened is that the tribes would be alongside it, camping, spending the night, and all of a sudden, a flash flood would occur. And this happened more than once. You would never guess that this could become a rushing floodwaters to take out not just homes, campsites, but also bridges. I mean, it really is deceptive.
Newspaper coverage over the years mentions just how bad the Badwater floods have been. A 1915 article from the Pinedale Roundup cited an entire train going into the flooded creek, buried up to its smokestack. Another article said that the 1923 flood of the Badwater wiped out 20 miles of train tracks near Bonneville, Wyoming, and 3 boxcars and 2 cabooses were swept away by the flood. While both of these train wrecks have been overshadowed by the Coal Creek train wreck that also happened in 1923, killing over 30 people, now that I've heard about these other wrecks where some people say the trains were never salvaged, I honestly want to go out there and see if I can find a boxcar or a telltale smokestack sticking up out of one of the sandbars of Badwater Creek. Jackie takes us back to 1886 for her first story along one of the tributaries of Badwater Creek.
So 1886, these prospectors came to this area, and it was called Old Camp Creek because in 1872, there was evidence that somebody had camped alongside there.
Jackie cites an 1886 news article about the abandoned camp.
It said that in the spring of the year, some hunters found on its banks a spot which had evidently been the scene of a camp during the greater portion of the preceding winter. A rude hut had been built, a temporary corral enclosed, and the marks of the presence of both men and horses for several months were plainly visible. But no trace could be found of the men or horses leaving the camp in the spring.
Although the camp was originally discovered by hunters, it was 1886 when a group of prospectors came upon the same abandoned camp.
These prospectors were at the camp, and one of them decided to go up this rocky wall. And while he is climbing there, he displaced this huge rock. This boulder just came crashing down. And when he looked down, he saw that there was this cavity in the rocky wall. And so he thought, oh, here's a cave. Let's see what's inside. Well, when he looked inside, what he found was a heap of human bones. He did not go into that cave. He called his friends over, and then they all went in and they took out the bones and they brought them down, and they discovered that it was 3 human beings who had been huddled together in this cave for, well, their guess was that this is the camp. These were the campers from 1872. They didn't know who these people were, but by the remnants that were left, they were able to identify one was a woman and 2 were men. And they had been murdered. It was obviously a murder because the skulls had evidence of being shot. And the woman actually had evidence of a knife being thrust into her breastbone. They called it a cave of death. They were really horrified by what they had seen. And they don't know who murdered them, why they were murdered, what happened. And what they did is they dug them a grave and put them in the grave and then went and told the story. I've been trying to find this location because in 1886, they renamed Old Camp to Skeleton Canyon. I have not been able to find the Cave of Death or Skeleton Canyon, but I'm not giving up. Summer's coming, and I think I can convince some people to come up with me and we'll check.
Jackie's next story centers around an aspen grove, also somewhere in the area of Badwater Creek.
So 8 years after the discovery of Skeleton Canyon, there was another gruesome discovery. And again, it was by accident, just by chance, that these group of cowboys were out there with their cattle, and they stumbled across 12 skeletons. They were able to identify that these 12 men were soldiers because all that was left were their buttons. So they had been there long enough where the fabric from their clothing had gone away and they were just skeletons. They were left out in the open and there was no other evidence of what happened. Or at least the cowboys didn't look around and see if there was bullets or arrows or what killed these 12 soldiers. They took the buttons again. AP picked it up. It spread throughout Wyoming, and people were like, who are these 12 soldiers?
Sure enough, the Salt Lake Herald in 1894 carried a blurb about the finding of the 12 bodies in an aspen grove near the Badwater, but they didn't say much else. A lot of these things about the story pique my interest. For one thing, do you remember when Bo Bergdahl walked away from his unit in Afghanistan a while back ago, and then everyone dropped everything trying to find him? I know that the Army was different back in the 1800s, but I still find it weird that 12 people would have been killed or at least gone missing, but I can't find any information about it. In fact, when you look at military history in Wyoming, you can easily find incidents where not many soldiers died, but there's still a lot of information available about what happened. For example, the 1868 Battle of Crazy Woman Creek near present-day Buffalo, Wyoming, only saw 2 soldiers die, but there's a ton of information about it that I've linked in the description. What I can find out about a battle near Badwater Creek was the 1874 Bates Battle, sometimes called the No-Wood Battle, the Battle of Young's Point, or the Battle of Snake Mountain. In a nutshell, the U.S. Army attacked an encampment of members of the Arapaho tribe, and from the sources that I can find, they say that the Army's attack didn't go well, and they ended up having to pull out from the scene of the fighting. I guess you could say maybe there's a link between this attack and what the Salt Lake Herald reported, but in this case, only 4 soldiers were killed, and on top of that, the blog, Today in Wyoming's History, which is linked in the description as well, shows extensive photos of the battle site, I believe taken in 2019, and you don't see any aspen trees in any of the pictures, or any other kind of trees. I guess you could say that maybe the trees had been cut down or just aren't there anymore, but still, I don't think that we're talking about the same event. One thing that would explain a lack of information about the 12 dead soldiers would be if they didn't die a violent death. Things like fights and battles tend to kind of rise to the top when it came to newspaper coverage and finding newspaper articles now. Like a lot of people in Wyoming and in the Rockies, perhaps these 12 had died from a horrible snowstorm or some other unpredicted weather mishap. Even then, I still think it's weird that these 12 people were found, but no one seemed to know anything about them. The article says that the men were identified as soldiers simply because buttons identified as soldiers' buttons were scattered amid the remains. I wonder if any of these people in fact really were soldiers. Could the buttons that came from a soldier's uniform have come from a uniform that perhaps had been traded or stolen or found? Or could the uniforms have belonged to discharged soldiers who were no longer in service but still wanted something warm to wear? In either case, a group of people that are no longer part of the military would not probably have as much documentation about who they were, where they were going, all of that.
There's one more skeleton story, and this one is actually my favorite because it's a ghost story. It is the story of Orrin and his wife, Catherine, and their son, Ray. It happened in 1940. They were at their homestead, which they give the exact mileage. It's 18 miles northwest of Arminto, Wyoming. So we're talking they're in the middle of nowhere. just this bleak plains. They're along the Badwater Creek. They love it because there's trees. It's beautiful. They understand the dangers of the flooding water, so they're far enough away so that if it does flood, they'll be fine. And, there's no refrigeration out there in the middle of nowhere, even in 1940. It doesn't even sound like they had electricity because I guess Catherine was kind of pestering him, like, I really need a cellar. So finally, Orrin, he's like, okay, I know this is going to take a few days. He hired a local sheep herder named Larson, and their 15-year-old son, Ray, was also recruited. And so the three of them are working on digging up this area by the Badwater Creek.
That was when Orrin saw something he'd never dreamed he'd see coming out of the dirt on his property.
They went to dump it, and he yelled at him to stop, but it was too late. And the reason he wanted them to stop is he saw flashing in the air a ruby ring. He just saw it sparkle. He could see the size of it. And so all of them stopped work, immediately started digging, searching for this ring. Catherine, who was in the cabin, came running out to see what was going on. When she heard what it was, she got on her hands and knees, and they're just digging until finally they had to give up. They could not find this ring. And Orrin knew that it was a big, sizable ruby ring, and he was so disappointed. But that's not the end of it. So they continued to dig, and then she looked out the window and again saw that they had stopped. She comes outside, says, what is going? And then she stops because they're looking down. They had to hit this ground that looked like it was burnt, and they had dug through it. And underneath the burnt ground was a skeleton. And they brought out the bones, they looked at it, and they're like, oh my goodness, what is this? And they did later identify it as a woman. A doctor came and identified it. In this skeleton, among the bones, were 5 arrowheads. So they started piecing together the story. Word spread. People came from all over. The old timers were like, we don't remember anyone dying from an attack. So it predated them. We know it happened then during the territory times. So you have 15-year-old Ray, or 16, depending on which story you're reading. But he takes the bones and puts them in a box and puts them under his bed.
Years later, Ray would go on to start the world's first death metal band, Bonebox. No, I'm kidding, he didn't do that, but seriously, Ray, what is your problem? Ray actually would soon regret bringing the bones into the house.
So what happens then is that Orrin and Catherine have to leave and go to town, and they leave Ray at the homestead all alone. Now, you're miles from anybody. You're out there, and he's trying to go to sleep, and all of a sudden he hears a rustling, and he wakes up and sees a ghostly thing going through the air. Terrifies him. Turns out it's his mom's dish towel.
When Jackie told me the story, I pictured the white of a dish towel flying through the dark as if a poltergeist had thrown it. But when I read the article Jackie sent me, apparently Ray just noticed his mom's dish towel hanging from the wall by the stove where he slept. For anybody that judges Ray too harshly, even as a grown man, I have woken up from sleep with my bathrobe hanging off my closet door and thought that someone in a long robe was coming after me. And I didn't even have a box of human remains under my bed to add to the drama.
But it was enough for him. So he takes the box in the middle of the night, crosses Badwater Creek, and hides it in the rafter of the barn and goes back to bed. And that's where the bones resided for years after that. They were always in the rafter. When somebody wanted to come see them, they would go in and take them down and show them the skeleton.
At first I thought it was odd that locals came out to see human remains in a barn, but I'm pretty sure if I lived back in that same time and place, I would probably go and bother this family and ask them to share their story so I could put it on whatever the 1940s equivalent of a podcast was.
The cellar was completed, and almost immediately, Catherine began experiencing something she could not explain. And it was a ghostly moaning that would happen. She would be down there working, and she'd hear this moan, and then it would turn into crying. And she thought, I'm losing my mind. And because her husband and Ray were gone, she went and got the old neighbor. Now, he was a very sensible person. She takes him down into the cellar and they stand there for a few minutes. Then again, it starts up, soft sound, and then a moan, and then crying. She's like, "Do you hear that?" And he's like, "You bet I do." He got out of that very quickly. And one of the things about homesteaders and people in Wyoming, do you think she's going to give up her cellar just because there's crying? So she continues for years to use that cellar and just gets used to hearing the crying and the moaning. And she did say, matter of factly, "I think it was the skeleton, that woman that we found, and she's crying because she doesn't know where her bones are."
I think that might actually be the true horror of this story. That inability to leave when there is no doubt in your mind that something is very wrong. It's like all the hardships that these people probably faced, from floods to blizzards to trouble with crops and animals, also had a smattering of supernatural problems whenever they went down into their equivalent of a refrigerator just to get something to eat. Maybe you could argue that the wind, which Wyoming has plenty of, was the real cause of this apparent moaning sound in the cellar. But don't you think that this family, or their old-timer neighbor, would have known the difference between wind and something that wasn't wind pretty quick? In fact, all alone out on this isolated spot, it seems like you would do anything to convince yourself that it was just the wind, or something natural and normal. It should be noted that when Orrin and Catherine were living in a nursing home in Thermopolis even years later, they stuck to the details of their story.
Catherine and Orrin were not looking to be celebrities. They weren't looking to be sensational. They're just saying, this is what happened. And we were glad to leave, and not hear the moaning anymore.
Jackie's article shows a picture from the 1970s of the now collapsed root cellar. And that photo, along with her excitement about maybe going to try to find some of the other places we've talked about, made me realize part of why I love looking into history in a place like Wyoming so much. Unlike in some states where the landscape has been changed by massive growth and people have lost their connection to family members and communities, in Wyoming we still live close to our history and can go off in search of it in isolated places like the Badwater and still see the land looking just like it did for the people we're going out to try to learn something more about.
It's fun to dig into this history and just discover what is out there.
I want to thank Jackie Dorothy for being on the show today. You can check out her podcasts by doing a search for Pioneers of Outlaw Country, as well as read the articles she's written at Cowboy State Daily. Many thanks to KHOL in Jackson, Wyoming for playing this show. If you're looking for a Christmas gift and know someone who likes to read, please do a search for the novel The Burqa Cave, or check it out in the description. It was my first novel about an Iraq War veteran who moves to a small town in Wyoming and tries to get to the bottom of a decades-old mystery about a girl being murdered on the local gun range. If you've enjoyed the show and would like to hear more episodes, do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day. Every day is 2 words in this case, podcast. And you can listen to every past episode I've ever done for free. Thank you so much for listening. I'll try to have a new episode to you in about 2 weeks.